Hello and welcome to DSR. I'm David Rothkopf, your host, and I'm joined this week by two of our close friends and regulars, Rosa Brooks of Georgetown University Law Center. How are you doing, Rosa?
I'm good, David.
Excellent. And Edward Luce of the Financial Times. How are you doing, Ed?
Wonderfully, thank you, David.
I'm glad. I'm glad everybody's back. The past couple of weeks, I have to say, just as an aside, that we have had the biggest audiences we've ever had on YouTube. There is a huge amount of interest in what's going on in the world. There's a huge amount of interest in what you guys have to say. So I'm extremely grateful for that. And I think the best place to kick things off here is, Ed, you had a really good column this week in the Financial Times, as you do every week. So I'm not, that's not something special. But I thought your point, which is, it was only a year ago, it seemed, when we were talking about de-risking from China and how we were dealing with that. And now you've got everybody in the world talking about de-risking from the United States. And of course, that can be in part because of what's going on around the Fed, what's going on around democracy in this country, what's going on with our foreign policy. And we're going to talk about some of that stuff to come. But I thought the best place to start would be perhaps you could just give a brief recap or at least highlight the key points you wanted to make.
Oh, well, thanks, David. Yeah, we were till very recently not just talking about, but anticipating some form of US-China decoupling. And now, really just within 12 months, but sooner than that, in fact, we were into a sort of global de-risking from the United States. And that shows up in the economics. The dollar, is being reduced gradually, but pretty steadily in one direction downwards in favor of gold, but also in favor of other currencies. The gold, though, is doing really well. The price of gold's gone up almost 75% since Trump was inaugurated last year. Gold being history's ultimate hedge against war and pestilence. And of course, you've got this dollar depreciation, which is certainly going to continue if Trump appoints one of his Kevins to replace Jay Powell. And the fact that he's now, launching criminal probes and subpoenas on Jay Powell for not having cut interest rates, I think is a pretty clear signal to the markets that their dollar is going to depreciate more, and that the cost of borrowing, ironically, therefore, is going to rise because the Fed only sets short-term rates. The markets should set real borrowing rates and mortgage rates. So that's de-risking, that we're already seeing. But on the geopolitical front, countries that were not having nuclear debates are having nuclear debates. South Korea has noticed that it's Venezuela's president who was abducted, not North Korea's president who was abducted. South Korea is very, very close, I think, in terms of the national debate, into a consensus shift on that subject, in which case Japan would be. But interestingly, something I never expected to hear, particularly since the Greenland thing has resurfaced in the last week or two from Trump, is that Canada, it's no longer taboo to discuss going nuclear in Canada, because what other leverage point would the Canadians have, being so, overshadowed by the world's superpower? So de-risking, is basically about the world becoming more expensive on the economic front, and it's about the world becoming more fearful and more security conscious everywhere, as the system that America upheld hypocritically, selectively, but it was still a system, is trashed by America itself. And so I think, de-risking of America it's a major long-term play that's now going on. You're seeing it everywhere.
Do you think, just to follow up on that, signs from the courts and other things that Trump can continue doing what he's doing or go after Powell, will have market consequences? Because the breaking of the story about Powell did not produce a big short-term consequence on Monday, but there was some movement in the longer-term bond markets, and I'm just wondering what your sense is.
I don't think the equity markets would care. I mean, if they see Kevin Hassett, which is likely, as being Trump's Fed chair, Well, what's that going to mean? Easy money. That's going to be Arthur Burns, him playing Arthur Burns to Trump's Nixon. That's going to be easy money, but of course it's going to be inflation. So in the short term, that's great for equities, for stocks, for the AI gold rush. But for debt, it's terrible. So I suspect the debt markets would move more strongly on that. But the great sort of, there's two sort of very briefly hidden icebergs here, not that hidden. One is that there's a lot of foreign government holdings of US Treasury bonds. They can sell them. This is a weapon. This is a weapon that China has, that Europe has, that other governments have around the world. And it's a significant share of treasuries, and it would push American interest rates up. And it would completely wipe out whatever Kevin Hassett's going to do at the short-term end, were that nuclear option to be used, as it were. And the second is, all of these countries, these allies, since the Second World War and continuously pretty much ever since, have held their gold reserves in America with the New York Fed. Now, can they be certain they'll get their gold back with Trump as president? Which court is going to stop him from refusing to repatriate gold reserves to Germany, for example? I mean, we're getting into that kind of conversation. So I believe the markets will price this eventually, and it will cost America.
You know, Rosa, there was a story the other day, yesterday or the day before, about the how the courts were doing on all of this. And it noted that Trump appointees were, going Trump's way a very high percentage of the time. And, there is, we talk about those things in the context of, as our legal system holding together. But it's got other consequences. It has consequence for how the world looks at us and whether they think our system of law is functioning. And, if Trump is able to sort of put his shoulder down and get rid of Fed independence, which is something that I think has been an objective of the Fed more or less since it was founded in 1913. It's going to be concerning. How do you think the courts are doing so far?
I thought that the most interesting thing in that New York Times piece was not so much how often Trump-appointed judges are siding with Trump, but the difference between how often other Republican-appointed judges were siding with Trump versus Trump-appointed judges siding with Trump. I don't remember offhand the specific numbers, but I think it was something along the lines of Democratic-appointed judges were siding with Trump, 40% of the time, which also should tell you something, that Democratically appointed judges, a substantial percentage of the time were nonetheless siding with Trump, that when they saw the laws being in his favor, that's the call they were making. Trump-appointed judges, I think it was about 85% siding with Trump. All Republican-appointed judges, I think it was 68 or so percent siding with Trump. And that spread between the 68% of, Republican judges who sided with Trump, I think what was striking to me both was that Republican judges overall were siding with him a whole lot, but that Trump-appointed judges were siding with him almost all the time. And that's a real shift, right? Because even though other Republican-appointed judges appointed by George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, earlier Republicans even in some cases, it's not that surprising that they're sympathetic to many of the arguments that come from a Republican administration, but they're also saying no. At least 30% of the time, whereas the Trump-appointed judges are not saying no at all.
Let's look to some of the specifics that are in the news right now. Today, there were meetings in the White House between White House Greenland czar J.D. Vance and some folks from Denmark and the EU about Greenland. These were followed by reports that said we had frank discussions, and we're still a long way apart. That seemed to suggest that the Danish and others went in and said, "No way," and Vance said, "Way." But Ed, this doesn't seem to be going away. I mean, it seems like Trump I mean, I remember we had a conversation a few weeks ago here, and I think David Sanger or somebody said, "Oh yeah, he's not going into Venezuela," and he went. And now it seems like he's going ahead and doing this. I think here we are in late stage Trump, and Trump's like, "Yeah, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. What's the harm? I mean, who can stop me? What's your sense of how this plays out?"
My sense is that Vance and Rubio were not there to sort of climb down and soften the edges and sort of finesse Trump's instincts. They were there to maybe deliver them in a slightly politer and more formal setting than Trump does, which is like every other minute. Whenever he's asked, he's keen to reiterate not just that he wants Greenland, but that the Chinese and the Russians are all over it, and all they have is dog sleds. So, I don't think, and it's really interesting watching the Danish response, they're digging in their heels more and more. And the right in Denmark are amongst the most vocal in condemning Trump here. So, as is often the case, he's not good for the right wing in other countries if he's targeting that country. Go ask Canada's conservatives. They're being, no government in Denmark would survive making any sovereignty concessions to Trump. And so the Danes are announcing they're sort of deploying units there, and then they're inviting other NATO European allies, including Britain and France, to conduct some military exercises in Greenland. I mean, this is getting quite interesting. The Trump pretext for wanting Greenland is a bit like his narco-terrorist pretext for, wanting Maduro. It's a pretext. It's got all the national security it wants from Greenland, and it can double, triple, quadruple. The offer is completely open. You can have all the exploration rights you don't yet have. You can double your bases, have new bases. We can cooperate on Arctic security. That's not the point. The point is he wants the territory. He wants to be Jefferson of the 21st century and have his Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah, well, he also, he said two things that I thought were, salient here, Rosa. One, which was psychologically salient, which was he said ownership matters, which was, kind of bizarre and reveals something we already knew about Trump. And the other was that we need Greenland. And I don't, I mean, as Ed points out, there's actually no reason we need Greenland. And one of the things the Danes said today was that you don't need Greenland. You don't need to pursue this. But it does
Trump is a bottomless pit of need, however, and he needs Greenland.
Well, I think that's right. He needs it. But the question is, he's got Rubio around him and J.D. Vance and all these others. Surely they realize that, going after Greenland and going hard will have a very deleterious effect on NATO, perhaps, could blow the whole thing up. And so you've got to ask yourself, if everybody knows that, is that the point?
I think that everyone should, of course, remember that Trump has been muttering about pulling out of NATO for a very long time now. I think the only seemingly positive surprise of the first year of the second Trump administration is he didn't pull out of NATO immediately, which many of us expected he would very likely do since he had talked about it so often. And he's made good, for better or for worse, generally for worse, on all of his other promises / threats. So it was a little surprising that he didn't withdraw from NATO. But it turns out that he was just waiting find some other more exciting way to destroy NATO, and it looks like he has settled upon exactly that way. I do think this stuff is not rational. I mean, I don't think we can say that often enough. That we still spend an astonishing amount of time and mental energy collectively saying things like, well, I wonder why he thinks this makes sense. It must be this or it must be that, or and there, there's no making sense of it, right? Because this is crazy shit. This is just Crazyland. It really is Crazyland. I mean, as you said, from any rational level, the U.S. has what it needs from Greenland, and then some. There's nothing on a rational level that we might need to do to protect ourselves or our allies, should we care about protecting our allies, that we can't already do. The Danes are perfectly happy to work with us. So this is basically doing it in order to do it, in order to give a big middle finger to NATO and to the Danes and to anybody else. This is playing chicken. Playing chicken with the entire rest of the world. And so far, Trump is winning the game of chicken, right? Because nobody else is as crazy. Um, the Venezuela stuff, I think we all thought, well, he's not going to have a full-scale invasion of Venezuela. And indeed he didn't. It was a limited purpose soft raid. They had already, it seems now fairly clear, through a combination of blackmail and bribery, gotten sufficient internal acquiescence to what would come post-Maduro to make it possible to do that in a relatively easy way, easy for the U.S., not easy for the Venezuelans particularly. I think it is possible that they will still look for some easy route in Greenland, and there are probably ways to bribe the right people, bribe and coerce the right people in Greenland to avoid some kind of full-scale U.S. military action, and to make it be something that is either Venezuela-like, which is not an occupying force, notwithstanding us saying we're going to run Venezuela. We're working through proxies internally at this point, as far as I can tell. I think something like that, and perhaps I hope. I can't believe I'm saying I hope, because this is still awful. But it's better than the alternative of a full-scale military action. Would be some kind of similar thing in Greenland, where I think that they are working very, very hard to figure out who do we need to bribe and who do we need to blackmail or coerce, so that we can do something in Greenland where we end up having total real estate control, quote unquote ownership, without actually having to actually have a genuine invasion. That would be my guess, right? And there are not that many people in Greenland. The population is extremely small. And although at the moment the Greenlanders seem quite appropriately pissed off, not to mention alarmed by Trump's rhetoric, we could essentially be bribing everybody in Greenland, and it wouldn't cost that much because there aren't that many people. And I'm sure that is very Trumpian, right? Would be like, what if I just say to everybody in Greenland, every single one of you, and as I said, it's a very small population, you each get $1 million. Hey, well, they sold it to me. I think so. That's what I would be looking for.
Well, and in fact, they said earlier this week that they would, consider offering each person of the 30,000 people in Greenland $100,000. Which
They're just going to raise the price a little bit, and eventually, Trump is a man who believes that everyone has a price. And if I were in Greenland, then I was like, oh shit, I might be thinking, well, this is a deal to take, or let's see if we can get the price up a little bit, and then at some point we take the deal because we're being coerced.
Yeah, it's true. Although they'd lose it in healthcare benefits, I'm sure.
They would.
Which, I think is something actually they're all pretty keenly aware of. But, Ed, early on, we talked about America first, and that this was going to be a more isolationist administration, and, setting aside all the absurd conversations from Trump talking about being a peacemaker. We could sit here and talk every 5 minutes for the next couple hours about a different international involvement of Trump. I mean, even as we've just talked about Venezuela, and we've talked about Greenland, and we've talked about international economic policy that is going to affect everybody in the world, U.S. troops are evacuating our base in Qatar because they expect there could be retaliation from the Iranians if we were to attack Iran, which, by the way, as far as I can tell, would serve no useful purpose. In fact, if we were to attack Iran on behalf of the demonstrators, it would stir
The
up
irony.
with our own situation, but it would also not only stir up nationalists, but it would give the government an excuse to say all the demonstrators are in cahoots with Trump. There's nothing that we could hit that would, sort of open the floodgates, it seems. As, by the way, our friend Max Boot has recently written. Ed, what do you expect there? You expect we're going to go and drop something on somebody in Iran because Trump likes these kind of in and out demonstrations of our military force without a lot of entanglements following them?
Hmm. I mean, I did do the Brzezinski biography, so I got steeped in the original mistakes of misreading Iranian public sentiment, when Carter admitted the Shah. But uh, Trump's, you cannot expect to listen to background briefings, let alone do background reading. He does remember one thing about Carter, which was the failed desert one leg of Operation Eagle Claw. And he's stated a couple of times in the last few days that he's not Carter. But if he wants to be not Carter, he needs to listen to his background briefings, assuming Langley is still allowed to provide them, about what a helping hand American bombing on behalf of the protesters would provide to the Iranian regime. This would enable them to sort of rally around the flag again, and would probably keep, the Revolutionary Guard, which has moderate and hardline wings, as does the sort of regime as a whole, from splitting. It would bring it together again. The goal here would be to get them to split and to have a certain section of the regime basically reach out to the protesters. That's how this ends peacefully-ish. But I don't think that's how Trump thinks. I have no prediction about whether he will actually strike or what those actual strike plans that have been drawn up for him look like, whether they be decapitation, which institutions he'd target, and whether there would, as Israel is urging, there would be more attacks on, the reconstituted subterranean Iranian nuclear program. I don't know the answer to any of that. What I do know is that Trump hasn't yet had a setback to using the military. He hasn't had, a disaster. And therefore he's bullish, and he's getting more trigger happy as this really quite rapidly as this president goes on. And I think it fills a psychological void that indicting, enemies at home doesn't fill. He's the emperor of the world. That's how
I think that's absolutely right, Rosa. And I think, there are two ways that this could change. One is somebody stands up to him and says, no, and we're going to push back. The Danes say, as they've said, by the way, we will fight back. Or the British and others move troops into Greenland and say, we will fight back.
Can you see that happening?
Personally, I don't rule it out, but so far, no. But that's one possibility, is somebody stands up to him, just like Jerome Powell stands up to him, right? Or people in the streets of Minneapolis stand up to him. And the other is that there is a Desert One, Black Hawk Down fiasco somewhere along the lines here. And all of a sudden he realizes that playing these military games does have a cost, that you can't just go in and go out. There's a lot of this talk about Venezuela. And as you pointed out, we didn't go in, we didn't invade. We don't have troops on the ground. We didn't actually do regime change. We don't control anything. Nothing is, the interesting thing is the media is talking about it like we had a great success in Venezuela. We haven't actually done anything in Venezuela.
Yeah.
And so, some of this is going to come to a head. I mean, there's, yet another thing that's unfolding this week is that the peace board for Gaza is meeting, led by the U.S., which, remember, the U.S. didn't want to be involved in this stuff, except Hamas doesn't really want to go along with it. Israel doesn't really want to go along with it. Meeting is one thing, but that looks like a fiasco waiting to happen. Each one of these things, Venezuela, the oil companies don't want to participate, and the Venezuelans aren't going to go along with it. All of these things look like he's pushed them as far as he can, but if he pushes a little further, it might blow up in his face. Am I just being crazy optimistic?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. I think you probably are, David. Because what you're forgetting, I think, is that so many Americans live in a separate little information bubble of their own. Even on Fox News, which is now the far left of the far right, frankly, and is watched mainly by people over the age of 65. Um, um, you look at things that are on the front page of every mainstream media outlet or at the very top of the news, and they just don't exist. They might as well not exist. So things that are Trump has had multiple setbacks on multiple things. You'd asked me earlier about the courts, and I didn't fully answer your question. How are the courts doing? The courts, by and large, he's been getting rebuked over and over and over by the courts, who are kind of saying what you are doing in a zillion areas is illegal and unconscionable. That is getting zero play in the right-wing media world. If there was a Black Hawk Down incident, that incident, keep in mind, and this was obviously 92, was it? I can't remember offhand, but the number of Americans killed was 30 some. I don't remember the exact number. It was shocking at the time. It was horrific. It was horrible for their families. It was a very small number in absolute terms. If 30 or 40 American military personnel were killed in a Venezuela situation, it would get virtually no coverage on Fox, much less in the far right. Or if it did, it would somehow be attributed to, the wokeness of prior military leaders who've now been fired by Pete Hegseth, who betrayed them in some bizarre and unspecified way, right? That it just wouldn't matter. Because it would all be either ignored or spun in a way that actually supported Trump. You can't, there would be a scale of disaster that couldn't be completely covered up, but it's hard to imagine something on that scale happening. It's equally hard to imagine act of resistance, say, from British troops to a Trump effort to take over Greenland, especially if they did it in some relatively limited way, where you had a limited military incursion coupled with bribing and blackmailing everybody in sight. So you could say with a slightly straight face, well, we now have a bunch of Greenland leaders who are standing up and saying, yeah, it's all fine. We love Donald Trump, right? That's the way they're operating. I do think that for those of us in the United States who do live in the what we once referred to as the reality-based community, um, um, which includes most independents, I do think it's already crystal clear from polls. A majority of Americans, a substantial majority of Americans, do not like what Donald Trump is doing. I think that if there was a free and fair presidential election rematch held today, he would not win. But I also think that what we have to worry about is not whether at the midterm elections or indeed in the 2028 election. What we have to worry about is not that a majority of Americans will by that point not yet have been persuaded that Trump is dangerous and bad for America and bad for the world. I think they've already been persuaded. I think that what we have to worry about is that we will not, in fact, have free and fair elections. And so the will of the majority of the American people will not be reflected in the electoral results. So that is my fear.
Well, that's a very serious fear. While Rosa was describing all of this, Ed, she talked about the British fighting back, which was an idea I brought up. And I couldn't tell whether you were smiling or grimacing, um, thinking about Iron Keir Starmer standing up to Donald Trump. But we did have, some European central bank people saying you can't do this with Jerome Powell. There are some stirrings there. The Danes have been impressively resolute, it seems to me, in all of this. I mean, Keir Starmer, I don't know if he knows what year it is, but there are other people who, they're showing some spine. Do you have any hope of anybody standing up to Trump?
Well, I mean, I was impressed. Yeah, Christine Lagarde, Andrew Bailey, governor of the English Central Bank of England. There have been a number of really sort of clear statements on that front, which was good to see. And the fact that Britain is discussing with Denmark, and that Denmark is very sensibly NATOizing its request for exercises in Greenland, this is smart. I don't think it's intended to result in a shootout with the Americans. It's intended to persuade the Americans that this would be really, really bad PR, and please don't do it. I don't know whether that will be sufficient for Trump. But I do know it'll raise the costs slightly. I mean, the problem, just to sort of get it back to what you asked me about at the opening, the problem with, de-risking from America is that some level, when the Americans, not just Trump, has been asking this, but successive American presidents, we'd like to raise the cost of protecting you. That's not an unreasonable request to make. To say spend more on defense, just, pay in more. But when a company asks a customer to pay more for a product, and that customer has no idea whether the product will ever be delivered, then of course, it's the way I put it is, this is an offer you cannot accept. It's the opposite of the mafia, of the Godfather line. It's an offer you cannot accept. So this sort of Greenland thing is very, very clarifying about the larger picture of the effect of Trumpism.
Well, this is true also, Rosa, in the case of Venezuela, where Trump has said, well, the oil companies will come in and they will, retool the Venezuelan oil industry and we'll all make a lot of money off of it. But all the oil companies know that after Trump will be somebody else, and that they go and have to put in tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars into Venezuela. They could lose it all again. And so again, it's goes back to Ed's point about an offer you can't accept. A lot of his calculus, calculus in Gaza. Well, we'll work it out, and then we're going to build casinos on the beach, or the calculus in Iran is, we'll go and threaten them, and then, they will stop their nuclear program as opposed to accelerating their nuclear program, et cetera, et cetera. All of it's based on a calculus that, I just don't feel is highly likely to work out either.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, I think, to me, the real mystery is why has this been not more clear to the business community in general from earlier on? Because I think what we know from countries around the world is that authoritarians can be great for business in the very near term. They're terrible for business in the longer term because everything gets personalized. Everything becomes, what'd you do for me, 5 minutes ago, and what are you going to do for me 5 minutes from now? And you can't, there's no predictability because everything depends on the whims of one person. And I think that, to me, that's always been obvious. I think to both of you, that's always been obvious. But to many in the business community, continued to delude themselves that somehow this was going to be a better world for them. And they're beginning to see, there are no guarantees of anything with these people. That you might get a short-term profit here and there, but then 2 weeks are going to go by and they're going to change their mind, especially when the personality you're dependent on is one as unstable as our current leader.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think we're grounded in the reality-based community, as you put it, even as we look at Crazyland from up close. But, a perfect example of all this was this week, Pete Hegseth goes to SpaceX and says, we're going to have AI for our military, and it's all going to be Grok, even as we see Grok get more into pornography and Nazism, and it's all going to be identified with Elon. Well, what's going to happen in the next administration when they come in and say, oh, yeah, this is the sexist, racist AI? You can't keep that, right?
But you know what they're doing, though? They're giving various companies a stake in ensuring that there is no next administration.
That is, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it because that's the big issue. Well, it is.
As usual, I'm really happy that I was able once again to allow us to close on a really negative note.
Yeah, well, and that's why you're here and have been for the past decade. And I have to say, looking back at the past decade, your record is pretty good. Things really suck. But in any event, I'm really glad to have the chance to talk to you guys. Ed, I know you're heading off to a far-flung place. Have a safe voyage there and bring back presents for all of us. Rosa, stay warm in your in the libraries of Georgetown or whatever that is behind you, and we will be back with all of you here with this and each and every one of our podcasts as we go forward, and as you If you like what you're hearing here, go to YouTube and subscribe to YouTube, where the numbers are growing and growing and growing, or go to the dsrnetwork.com and support what we're doing with a couple of bucks a month. This is a time when independent media is super important, and although we remain the world's smallest media company, we do have a role to play here. I think expert views, like you've just heard, are important, and we hope you'll support us. Until then, thanks, Rosa. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.